Get on the ground or I will put a bullet in your skull." That was the only warning Special Agent Isaiah Sterling got before the cold barrel of a Glock 17 was pressed against his temple. It wasn't a criminal holding the gun. It was a man with a badge, a man who saw a black man in a hoodie near a luxury SUV and decided he was guilty before he even stepped out of his patrol car. What Officer Derek Higgins didn't know was that the man he was about to execute wasn't a car thief. He was the highest-ranking FBI field operative in the state. And this mistake was about to cost Higgins everything. The rain in Seattle doesn't wash things clean. It just makes the grime slicker. It was 8:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of night where the streetlights reflect off the asphalt like spilled oil. Isaiah Zeke Sterling was tired. Not just the physical exhaustion of a double shift, but a bone-deep weariness that came from 3 months undercover, infiltrating a trafficking ring in the port of Tacoma. He had spent the last 90 days living as Snake, a low-level enforcer with a rap sheet longer than his arm. He hadn't shaved in weeks. His hair was grown out into unruly twists, and he was wearing a faded, oversized grey hoodie stained with motor oil. To anyone passing by the upscale Whole Foods on West 4th, he looked like trouble. But underneath the grime and the hoodie, Isaiah was a senior special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had just debriefed his handlers and was finally heading home to his wife, Sarah, and their 4-year-old daughter. He had stopped at the grocery store for one reason: oat milk. Sarah had texted him that they were out, and he would have walked through fire to make sure his little girl had her cereal in the morning. He walked out of the sliding doors, the brown paper bag tucked securely under his arm to shield it from the drizzle. He headed toward his personal vehicle, a brand-new, obsidian black Cadillac Escalade. It was his one luxury, bought with the bonus from the RICO case last year. He unlocked the car remotely, the lights flashing amber in the gloom. He opened the back door to set the grocery bag down on the seat so it wouldn't tip over. As he leaned in, adjusting the bag, he heard the crunch of tires on wet gravel behind him. It wasn't a slow roll. It was an aggressive, fast stop. Isaiah's instincts, honed by 15 years in federal law enforcement, flared. He didn't jerk upright. He moved slowly, his hands coming out of the car empty, palms open. He turned his head. A patrol car from the local precinct, Unit 4 Alpha, was parked diagonally behind his Escalade, blocking him in. The spotlight mounted on the pillar blinded him instantly. "Step away from the vehicle," a voice barked over the PA system. It was distorted, but the aggression was clear. Isaiah squinted against the glare. "I'm just putting groceries in my car, officer," he called out, his voice calm, level. The command voice they taught at Quantico. "I said step away from the damn vehicle. Now!" The driver's door of the cruiser flew open. A figure stepped out into the rain. Officer Derek Higgins was a man who wore his uniform like a costume of authority. He was broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with a buzz cut that was a week past regulation. He had a reputation in the precinct, though Isaiah didn't know it yet. Higgins was known as the Hammer by his buddies in the locker room, because to him, everyone he met on the street looked like a nail. Higgins already had his hand on his holster. He didn't see a tired father getting milk. He saw a black man in a dirty hoodie leaning into a $90,000 car in a neighborhood he clearly didn't belong in. "Officer," Isaiah said, keeping his hands visible at shoulder height, "my ID is in my front pocket. I am the owner of this vehicle. If you let me—" "Shut your mouth!" Higgins screamed, closing the distance between them with surprising speed. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know a smash and grab when I see one? Get your hands on the hood. Now!" Isaiah assessed the situation. He was armed. His service weapon, A Sig Sauer P226 was in a holster at the small of his back, concealed by the hoodie. If he reached for his wallet, Higgins might see the print of the gun and fire. If he didn't comply, Higgins might fire anyway. "Officer, listen to me carefully," Isaiah said, lowering his hands slowly toward the hood of the Escalade. "I am armed. I have a badge. I am a federal agent." Higgins let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Yeah, right. And I'm the King of England. I know your type. Always got a story. You're armed? Good. Give me a reason." Higgins wasn't listening. He was escalating. He was operating on adrenaline and prejudice, a dangerous cocktail. He grabbed Isaiah by the shoulder of his hoodie and slammed him hard against the side of the Escalade. The impact rattled Isaiah's teeth. The paper bag in the back seat tipped over, and the carton of oat milk burst, leaking white liquid onto the pristine leather. "There is no need for this," Isaiah said through gritted teeth, fighting the urge to use a Krav Maga disarm maneuver that would have snapped Higgins's wrist in 2 seconds. "Check the plates. Run the tag. It comes back to me." "I don't need to run nothing," Higgins hissed, leaning in close. He smelled of stale coffee and peppermint tobacco. "I caught you in the act. You're going downtown, and if you twitch, you're going to the morgue." Higgins kicked Isaiah's legs apart, patting him down aggressively. His hand brushed the hard lump at the small of Isaiah's back. Higgins froze. "Gun!" he screamed, stumbling back and ripping his own weapon from its holster. "He's got a gun!" The atmosphere in the parking lot shifted from tense to lethal in a heartbeat. Officer Derek Higgins didn't just draw his weapon. He panicked. He leveled his Glock 17 at Isaiah's chest, his finger already curling around the trigger guard. His breathing was ragged, hyperventilating. This was the most dangerous type of cop, scared, incompetent, and eager to prove he was in control. "Don't you move! Don't you move a muscle!" Higgins shrieked. His voice cracked. Isaiah froze. He stood perfectly still against his car, the rain plastering the hoodie to his skin. He looked directly down the barrel of the gun. He could see the rifling inside. He could see the tremor in Higgins's hand. "Officer," Isaiah said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming deadly calm. "My weapon is holstered. My hands are in the air. You are pointing a loaded firearm at a federal agent. You are making a mistake that you cannot undo. Shut up! Get on your knees!" Higgins roared. "Hands behind your head! Interlace your fingers!" Around them, the commotion had drawn attention. Shoppers pushing carts stopped in their tracks. A woman in a raincoat gasped and pulled her phone out. A security guard from the store, an older man named Earl, who had known peace for most of his shift, came jogging out, his eyes wide. "Hey, what's going on here?" Earl shouted, keeping a safe distance. "Back off!" Higgins swung the gun wildly toward the security guard before snapping it back to Isaiah. "This suspect is armed and dangerous. Call 911. Get back up!" Isaiah seized the moment of distraction. "My badge is in my left front pocket. It's a bifold leather case. It has a gold shield and FBI credentials. If you look at it, we can end this." "You reach for that pocket and you die," Higgins spat. "I know the drill. You go for the wallet, you pull a piece. I ain't falling for it." "I'm not reaching," Isaiah said. "I'm telling you to check it. You're the one holding the gun." Higgins was sweating now, despite the cold rain. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him. He needed to assert dominance. He needed to humiliate this man to justify his own fear. "Get on the ground," Higgins ordered. "Face down in the mud. Now." Isaiah didn't move. He knew that if he went to the ground, he gave up all leverage. If he went prone, Higgins could claim he reached for his waistband. He had to stay upright. He had to stay visible to the cameras he knew were now recording from the crowd. "I am not getting on the ground," Isaiah stated. "I am complying with your order to keep my hands up. I am identifying myself as a federal officer. Dispatch a supervisor immediately." "You don't give orders here, boy," Higgins snapped, the racial slur slipping out with venomous ease. The crowd gasped. The phones were definitely recording now. Higgins realized he had slipped. Anger flushed his face red. He stepped closer, abandoning cover, closing the distance to striking range. It was a tactical error, but his ego was driving the car now. "I gave you a lawful order," Higgins growled, raising the gun so it was aimed directly at Isaiah's forehead. "Last warning." Isaiah looked into Higgins's eyes. They were dilated, glassy. The man was on a power trip so intense it was like a narcotic high. "Officer 4 Alpha," Isaiah said, reading the unit number on the cruiser. "My name is Special Agent Isaiah Sterling. My badge number is 8940. I report directly to Assistant Director Miller. If you pull that trigger, there won't be a hole deep enough for you to hide in." "Liar!" Higgins screamed. He was shaking now. He couldn't reconcile the image of the thug in the hoodie with the articulate, authoritative voice coming out of him. It broke his worldview, and instead of accepting it, he rejected it with violence. Higgins lunged forward and pistol-whipped Isaiah across the face. Crack! The steel barrel struck Isaiah's cheekbone, splitting the skin instantly. Blood sprayed onto the wet asphalt. Isaiah's head snapped back, stars exploding in his vision. He staggered, catching himself against the Escalade, but he didn't drop his hands. He didn't fight back. He knew that one defensive move would be Higgins's excuse to unload the clip. "Stop it! You can't do that!" a woman in the crowd screamed. "He didn't do anything!" another man shouted. "Back the hell up!" Higgins waved the gun at the crowd again. "He resisted! You all saw it! He resisted!" Isaiah spit blood onto the pavement. He felt the warm trickle running down his neck into his hoodie. The pain was sharp, clarifying. The fear was gone. Now there was only cold, calculated rage. "That," Isaiah whispered, staring at Higgins with eyes like flint, "was assault on a federal officer. That's a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence." "I'm cuffing you," Higgins panted. He holstered his weapon aggressively, but didn't secure the strap, grabbing his handcuffs instead. He grabbed Isaiah's wrist and twisted it behind his back with unnecessary force, wrenching the shoulder socket. Click! The first cuff went on. "You like that?" Higgins sneered, tightening it until it cut into the skin. "You like playing tough guy? Let's see how tough you are in the holding cell." Just as Higgins reached for the second hand, a siren wailed, not the standard yelp of a patrol car, but the deep, guttural rumble of a high-performance engine. Tires screeched as a black Chevy Tahoe tore into the parking lot, hopping the curb and scattering wet mulch. Blue and red strobe lights flashed from the grille, the visor, the mirrors. It wasn't a standard police unit. It was an unmarked command vehicle. 2 more cars followed. Standard cruisers, but they were driving fast, urgent. Higgins looked up, confused. "About time backup got here," he muttered, yanking Isaiah's arm again. "Hey, over here! I got the perp secured!" The door of the black Tahoe flew open before the car even fully stopped. A tall man with silver hair, wearing a trench coat over a suit, stepped out. He didn't look like a beat cop. He looked like authority personified. It was Police Chief O'Malley, and behind him, jumping out of the other cruisers, weren't just patrol officers. There were 4 men in tactical vests with FBI emblazoned on the back in bold yellow letters. Higgins blinked, the rain dripping into his eyes. "Chief," he stammered. "Chief, I got him. He was resisting. He's got a gun." Chief O'Malley didn't look at Higgins. He looked at the man bleeding against the Escalade, with one hand cuffed. He looked at the face of the man who had been his liaison on the Joint Terrorism Task Force for 3 years. O'Malley's face went pale, then turned a shade of purple that terrified his subordinates. "Officer Higgins!" O'Malley roared, his voice booming across the parking lot like thunder. Take your hands off him. Step away from that man immediately." Higgins froze, the key to the cuffs in his hand. "But, Chief, he's a suspect. He's armed." One of the FBI tactical agents raised an AR-15, aiming it squarely at Higgins's chest. "Drop the cuffs, Higgins! Hands in the air! Do it now!" The world seemed to tilt on its axis for Derek Higgins. The hunter had just become the prey. For a terrifying 3 seconds, Officer Derek Higgins didn't move. His brain was misfiring, unable to process the contradiction before him. In his world, he was the law. He was the predator. But the red laser dot dancing on his chest from the FBI agent's rifle said otherwise. "I said drop the weapon and get on your knees." The FBI tactical lead, a man named Agent Miller, who had worked with Isaiah for a decade, screamed the order. His voice was not a request, it was a promise of violence. Higgins's hand shook violently. The handcuffs dangled from his fingers, clinking against his belt. I'm a police officer. He's the suspect. He's armed. Last chance," Miller roared, stepping forward, his boots splashing heavily in the puddles. Chief O'Malley broke the paralysis. He lunged forward, not caring about protocol, driven by sheer fury and the nightmare of the PR disaster unfolding before him. He grabbed Higgins by the collar of his tactical vest and yanked him backward. "You idiot!" O'Malley shouted, spitting in Higgins' face. "Drop it!" Higgins stumbled, his Glock clattering onto the wet asphalt. Before the gun even stopped sliding, 2 FBI agents were on him. They didn't treat him with professional courtesy. They didn't give him the brother-in-blue treatment. One agent kicked Higgins' legs out from under him, sending him crashing face first into the gravel, the exact spot where he had tried to force Isaiah. "Oof!" Higgins grunted as the wind left his lungs. A heavy knee pressed into the back of his neck, pinning his face into the mud. His arms were wrenched behind his back, far past the point of comfort, and he felt the cold bite of steel cuffs. Not his own cuffs, federal cuffs. "Officer Derek Higgins, you are under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon on a federal officer, deprivation of rights under color of law, and false imprisonment." Agent Miller recited the rights, his voice cold as ice. Higgins writhed, mud coating his lips. "What? Federal officer? You guys are crazy. He's a thug in a hoodie." "Shut your mouth," Miller barked, hauling Higgins up by his biceps. He dragged the suspended officer over to the hood of the chief's Tahoe. Meanwhile, Chief O'Malley rushed to Isaiah. The chief looked stricken. He saw the blood dripping from Isaiah's chin, staining the grey hoodie crimson. He saw the swelling already closing Isaiah's left eye. "Zeke. God, Zeke, I am so sorry," O'Malley stammered, his hands hovering, unsure if he should touch the wounded agent. "I didn't know it was you. Dispatch just said, God." Isaiah stood straight, despite the dizziness swimming in his head. He didn't look at O'Malley. He looked at the junior officer, who was now trembling as he unlocked the handcuff from Isaiah's right wrist. "Easy," Isaiah told the junior officer, his voice raspy. "Don't shake, just turn the key." The cuff clicked open. Isaiah rubbed his wrist, the skin raw and red. He turned to O'Malley. The friendship they had shared over beers at the FOP lodge was gone. In its place was the cold, hard distance of a professional who had been betrayed. "You have a rogue element, Chief," Isaiah said quietly. The quietness was worse than shouting. "He profiled me. He assaulted me. He almost executed me in a parking lot over a carton of oat milk." "I know," O'Malley said, wiping rain from his face. "I know. We'll handle it internally. No," Isaiah cut him off. "There will be no internal affairs investigation where he gets paid administrative leave for 6 months while you sweep this under the rug. This is a federal crime scene now." "That man," Isaiah pointed a steady finger at Higgins, who was being shoved into the back of the FBI SUV. Assaulted a senior special agent. The Bureau is taking jurisdiction. Higgins, still struggling in the back of the SUV, heard this. He pressed his face against the window, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible realization. Senior Special Agent. The words echoed in his skull. Isaiah reached into his sodden pocket and pulled out his badge case. He flipped it open. The gold shield gleamed under the strobing police lights. He held it up for the crowd, for the cameras, and finally, he walked over to the window where Higgins sat. He held the badge up to the glass. "Take a good look, Higgins," Isaiah said, his voice audible even through the glass. "You wanted to see my ID? Here it is." Higgins slumped back in the seat, all the color draining from his face. He looked like a child who had just realized he'd broken something irreplaceable. "Medical is en route," Agent Miller said, stepping up to Isaiah. "Zeke, you're bleeding pretty bad. That cheek looks fractured." "I'm fine," Isaiah said, though he swayed slightly. "Secure the scene. I want his body cam footage pulled immediately before it accidentally gets corrupted. I want the dash cam from his cruiser, and I want the security tapes from Whole Foods." "Already on it," Miller nodded. "We're locking it all down." Isaiah looked around the parking lot. The crowd had grown. People were cheering. A young black teenager in a varsity jacket was filming, his phone held high. Isaiah met the kid's eyes and nodded. The kid nodded back, a look of respect and vindication on his face. For Isaiah, the physical pain was secondary. The real pain was knowing that if he hadn't been who he was, if he had been a teacher, a mechanic, or just a father without a badge, he would likely be dead right now. And Higgins would have gotten a medal for it. That thought hardened his heart into diamond. He wasn't going to let this go. He was going to burn Higgins' career to the ground, and then he was going to salt the earth. 2 hours later, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by the throbbing ache of a fractured zygomatic arch. Isaiah sat in the observation room of the FBI field office on 3rd Avenue. He had refused to go to the hospital until he saw Higgins processed. A paramedic had butterflied the cut on his cheek and given him an ice pack, which he held against his face. Through the one-way mirror, he watched Derek Higgins. The former officer looked small in the metal chair. They had taken his uniform. He was wearing an orange federal jumpsuit now, stripping him of the psychological armor the badge had provided. His hands were cuffed to the table. Agent Miller and the assistant director of the Seattle field office, Sarah Jenkins, were in the room with him. This wasn't a standard interrogation. This was a dismantling. "I have a right to my union rep," Higgins muttered, staring at the table. "I have a right to counsel." "Your lawyer is on the way," Director Jenkins said. She was a woman of few words, known for her terrifying competency. "But your union rep, he's not coming." Higgins looked up, startled. "What?" "The union always comes. They have to." "They watched the body cam footage, Derek," Jenkins said, dropping a tablet onto the metal table with a clatter. "We sent it over as a courtesy. The rep called back 5 minutes later. He said, and I quote, 'We cannot defend indefensible conduct that violates the core tenets of law enforcement. You're on your own.' It was a lie, or at least a manipulation. The union would eventually send someone. But in that moment, it shattered Higgins's hope. The blue wall of silence hadn't just cracked, it had evaporated. "I thought he was reaching for a gun," Higgins pleaded, his voice cracking. It was dark. He was wearing a hoodie. He fit the description of a suspect for a 211 in the area. "A 211. Miller raised an eyebrow. "Robbery. We checked the logs, Higgins. The only robbery reported in that district was 3 days ago. The suspect was a 6-foot white male with a neck tattoo. Agent Sterling is black, 5'10", and has no tattoos. Try again." I sensed a threat, Higgins stammered. He was aggressive. He refused to comply. We have the audio, Miller said, leaning in. He identified himself 3 times. He offered to show ID. He kept his hands visible. The only aggression came from you. You pistol-whipped a man who was standing still. Isaiah watched from the other side of the glass. He felt a vibration in his pocket. It was his wife, Sarah. He hadn't told her yet. He texted back. Working late. Unexpected case. Love you. He couldn't let her see him like this yet. Inside the interrogation room, the pressure was mounting. Let's talk about your history, Derek, Director Jenkins said, opening a thick file. Because once we took jurisdiction, we got access to everything. Not just the active complaints, but the ones your sergeant buried. Higgins swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about. 16 excessive force complaints in 4 years, Jenkins read, flipping pages. April 2023, you broke the arm of a college student for resisting during a traffic stop. The dash cam malfunctioned. August 2024, you tasered a grandmother because she didn't exit her vehicle fast enough. Settlement paid by the city. Jenkins looked up, her eyes hard. You've cost the taxpayers of Seattle $2 million in settlements, Derek. But you never faced charges because you always claimed officer safety. You always hid behind the badge. But today you assaulted a federal agent. And under 18 U.S. Code, Section 111, the penalty for assault with a deadly weapon on a federal officer is up to 20 years. Higgins began to weep. It wasn't a cry of remorse. It was the selfish, ugly crying of a bully who realizes the teacher is finally watching. I didn't know, Higgins sobbed. I swear to God, if I knew he was a Fed, I would have let him go. I just thought he was some nobody. In the observation room, Isaiah closed his eyes. That was it, the confession. Miller slammed his hand on the table, making Higgins jump. And that is exactly the problem. You thought he was a nobody, so you thought you could crush him. You thought his rights didn't matter because he wasn't wearing a suit. You only respect the power that can hurt you. Miller stood up and walked to the door. We're done here. Book him. No bail. He's a flight risk and a danger to the community. As Miller and Jenkins exited the room, leaving Higgins sobbing alone in the cold fluorescent light, they entered the observation deck. You heard that? Jenkins asked Isaiah. Loud and clear, Isaiah said, standing up. The ice pack was warm now. He admitted he profiles based on perceived status. It's a civil rights violation on top of the assault. We're going to throw the book at him, Zeke, Jenkins promised. But there's something else. What? The chief is in the lobby, Jenkins said grimly. And the mayor is on the phone. The video from the parking lot. The teenager's video, it's gone viral. 2 million views in an hour. Justice for Zeke is trending. The city is about to explode. Isaiah walked to the window of the office, looking out at the rainy Seattle skyline. He had wanted to go home. He had wanted to drink oat milk and read a bedtime story. Instead, he had become a symbol. Let the chief in, Isaiah said, turning back to them. I have a few conditions if he wants to keep his city from burning down tonight. The door opened and Chief O'Malley walked in. He looked 10 years older than he had in the parking lot. He held his hat in his hands. Agent Sterling, O'Malley said, his voice humble. Zeke, the mayor wants a joint press conference to show unity, to show that justice is being served. Isaiah looked at the chief. He thought about Higgins' words. I just thought he was some nobody. I'll do the press conference, Isaiah said slowly, but not for you, and not for the mayor. Name your terms, O'Malley said. 1, Isaiah said, ticking off a finger. Higgins is fired, not suspended. Fired. Effective immediately. Publicly. Done. O'Malley nodded instantly. 2, Isaiah continued. You reopen every single excessive force complaint against him, every settlement, and you let the FBI Civil Rights Division audit them. O'Malley hesitated. That would expose the department's negligence. It would ruin careers. But he looked at Isaiah's swollen face and nodded. Okay. Done. And 3. Isaiah stepped closer, entering the chief's personal space. You are going to stand at that podium, and you are going to admit that your officer profiled me. You aren't going to say it was a misunderstanding. You aren't going to say errors were made. You are going to say he targeted a black man because of his bias. And the only reason I'm alive is because I had a badge of my own. O'Malley paled. Zeke, that's political suicide. The Union will eat me alive. Then get out of my office, Isaiah said, turning his back, and I'll give my own press conference. There was a long silence in the room. The hum of the server banks was the only sound. Finally, O'Malley sighed, a sound of defeat. Fine, I'll say it. I'll say it all. Isaiah nodded. The first round of karma had been delivered. Higgins was in a cell. The department was bending the knee. But Isaiah knew the fight wasn't over. The court case would be brutal. Higgins's lawyers would try to dig up dirt on Isaiah's undercover work to discredit him. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Isaiah Sterling had spent his life hunting monsters in the dark. A dirty cop in a bright courtroom? That was light work. Get me a fresh shirt, Isaiah said to Miller. I have a statement to make. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but the court of public opinion spins at the speed of light. In the weeks following the arrest, the narrative began to shift. It started in the dark corners of the internet, forums and social media groups dedicated to backing the blue at any cost. A GoFundMe page for Derek Higgins raised $250,000 or so in 3 days. The description painted him as a decorated veteran officer who was being railroaded by the woke federal government for doing his job in a high-crime area. Then came the lawyer. Robert the Shark Sterling, no relation to Isaiah, was a high-priced defense attorney from Chicago who specialized in getting dirty cops off the hook. He arrived in Seattle wearing a 3-piece suit that cost more than Higgins made in a year. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about the narrative. And he knew exactly how to dismantle Isaiah Sterling. The strategy was simple. Dirty the victim. It began on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the incident. Isaiah was at home, still on medical leave while his cheekbone healed, helping his daughter, Maya, tie her shoes for preschool. The TV was on in the background, tuned to the local news. Breaking news, the anchor announced. Sources close to the investigation allege that the FBI agent at the center of the viral parking lot arrest, Isaiah Sterling, has a history of violence and was actually the subject of an internal conduct review. Isaiah froze. Sarah, his wife, walked into the room with a cup of coffee, her eyes glued to the screen. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. The screen showed a grainy photo of Isaiah from his undercover operation, the snake persona. He looked menacing, unshaven, dealing with a known cartel member. The context was missing. To the average viewer, it just looked like Isaiah was a criminal. "They leaked the undercover file," Isaiah whispered, a cold pit forming in his stomach. "That's classified. Someone in the precinct leaked it to the press to make me look like a thug." The news report continued. Robert the Shark appeared on the courthouse steps, microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he smiled smoothly, "my client, Officer Higgins, is a hero. He recognized a dangerous individual. We have reason to believe Agent Sterling was acting erratically, perhaps even under the influence, which is why he refused to comply. We will prove that Officer Higgins was merely following his training to neutralize a perceived threat. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Within hours, the narrative split the city. Half the people saw a racist attack. The other half saw a misunderstood cop dealing with a suspect federal agent. Isaiah's phone began to ring. It was Assistant Director Jenkins. "Zeke, don't watch the news," Jenkins said, her voice tight. "Too late," Isaiah replied. "They're using Snake against me. We know. We're tracing the leak, but Zeke, it gets worse. The defense filed a motion to dismiss based on qualified immunity and reasonable fear. The judge assigned to the case is Judge Harrison. He's old school, very pro-police." "So Higgins walks?" Isaiah asked, his grip tightening on the phone until the plastic creaked. "Not if we can help it. But the trial is going to be a bloodbath. They are going to put you on trial, Zeke. They're going to drag your undercover work, your use of force reports, everything into the light. They want to make the jury fear you more than they hate Higgins." Isaiah looked at his daughter, who was happily oblivious, playing with her backpack straps. He realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about whether the truth mattered at all. That afternoon, Isaiah went back to the office, ignoring the reporters camping on his lawn. He met Miller in the war room. The walls were covered with timelines and evidence. "We need more," Isaiah said, staring at Higgins's mugshot. "The assault charge is solid, but with this lawyer and this judge, he might get off with probation and a slap on the wrist. We need to bury him." "We audited his files," Miller said, rubbing his temples. "We found the excessive force complaints. It shows a pattern, but the defense will argue those are just complaints from criminals." Isaiah narrowed his eyes. "Go deeper. Higgins was terrified when I said I was a Fed. More terrified than a cop should be, just for making a bad stop. He was shaking. Why? Maybe he knew he screwed up? No." Isaiah shook his head. "He acted like he was caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Look at the location. Whole Foods parking lot. Upscale area. Why was he there? His patrol zone is 4 miles east. He was out of sector." Miller typed on his keyboard. "You're right. GPS puts him way out of bounds. He didn't call it in either." "He was hunting," Isaiah murmured. "But not for a robber. Check his financials. Check his phone records. Not the department phone. The burner. We didn't find a burner on him." "Every dirty cop has a burner," Isaiah said. "Check the dashcam footage again. The 10 minutes before he pulled up on me. What was he doing?" Miller pulled up the video file. They watched the grainy footage of the rainy streets. Higgins was parked in an alleyway for 20 minutes before driving to the grocery store. He seemed to be waiting. Then he made a call. But the audio from the cruiser didn't pick up the other side of the conversation because Higgins had turned on the AM radio to mask it. "He was meeting someone," Isaiah said, "or waiting for a drop." "Zeke," Miller said slowly, zooming in on the video. "Look at the timestamp, 8:30 p.m., just before he came to you." "Yeah? Look at the car passing the alley." Miller pointed to a blur on the screen. "That's a black Escalade, just like yours." Isaiah felt a chill. He didn't stop me because of a 2-on-1 robbery. He stopped me because he thought I was someone else. Someone in a black Escalade. "If we can find out who he thought you were," Miller said, a grin slowly spreading across his face, "then we don't just have a racist cop. We have a corrupt one. And the shark won't be able to spin that." "Get the license plate reader data for that intersection," Isaiah ordered. "Find every black Escalade that passed through there between 8 hours and 9 hours p.m. We're going to find Higgins's real target." The counterattack had begun. The trial of United States versus Derek Higgins began under a cloud of heavy security. The federal courthouse was surrounded by protesters, one side chanting, "Black Lives Matter," the other holding "Blue Lives Matter" signs. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Inside, courtroom 4B was packed. Isaiah sat at the prosecution table next to the U.S. attorney, a sharp woman named Elena. No, named Sarah. Wait, his wife is Sarah. Named Audrey Vance. No, Vance is banned. Named Audrey Kincaid. On the defense side, Derek Higgins sat wearing a modest sweater and glasses, looking like a high school librarian. Beside him, Robert the Shark Sterling looked confident, practically preening for the jury. The first 2 days were brutal. The defense hammered Isaiah during cross-examination. "Agent Sterling," the Shark paced back and forth, "is it true that in your role as Snake, you hospitalized 2 men in a bar fight?" "I was maintaining cover." "They attacked me," Isaiah replied calmly. "So you are capable of extreme violence when you feel threatened?" "I am capable of self-defense." "And isn't it true," the Shark leaned in, "that when Officer Higgins approached you, you were still decompression from this violent persona, that you might have projected an attitude of hostility?" "I was buying milk," Isaiah said flatly. "I identified myself." "So you say." The Shark dismissed him. But Officer Higgins saw a threat. He saw a man who fits the profile of a violent offender. The jury looked conflicted. The defense was successfully muddying the waters, making it a he said she said regarding the tone of the encounter. But on the 3rd day, the prosecution played their trump card. Audrey Kincaid stood up. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Special Agent Miller to the stand, and we introduce new evidence, marked Exhibit G." The Shark stood up immediately. "Objection. New evidence? We haven't seen this." "It was discovered and processed yesterday, Your Honor," Kincaid said coolly, "relevant to motive." Judge Harrison, intrigued, allowed it. Miller took the stand. He looked tired but triumphant. He plugged a laptop into the courtroom's presentation system. "Agent Miller," Kincaid asked, "can you explain what we are looking at?" "This," Miller pointed to the screen, "is a timeline of Officer Higgins's movements on the night of the incident. As you can see, he was 4 miles out of his patrol zone." "Did he have a reason to be there?" "He claimed he was patrolling for a robbery suspect, but we pulled the automated license plate reader data for the intersection of 4th and Main." A spreadsheet appeared on the screen. At 8:32 p.m., a black Cadillac Escalade passed the intersection, Miller explained. It was registered to a man named Dominic "Dom" Rossi, a known mid-level distributor for the Seattle crime syndicate. The courtroom murmured. Higgins shifted in his seat, his librarian facade cracking. "And at 8:40 p.m., Miller continued, Agent Sterling's black Escalade passed the same spot. Both cars are identical. Both drivers were wearing hoodies. But there is one difference." "And what is that?" "Dominic Rossi," Miller said, looking directly at Higgins, "was carrying $50,000 in cash that night for a supply run. We know this because we arrested Rossi 2 days ago on unrelated charges, and he gave us interesting information." The Shark was on his feet. "Objection! Hearsay!" "It's not hearsay if we have the digital footprint," Miller shot back. He clicked a button. Audio filled the courtroom. It wasn't from a wiretap. It was a voicemail. "Yo, D-Man, it's Higgins. I'm at the spot. I know you're coming through tonight with the package. You're gonna pay the toll, or you're gonna have a bad night. Don't make me use the lights." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Higgins's face turned the color of old ash. The Shark stopped mid-objection, his mouth hanging open. He looked at his client, realizing he hadn't just been defending a racist cop, he had been defending a shaking-down gangster with a badge. "We recovered this voicemail from Rossi's phone," Miller stated. "Officer Higgins wasn't profiling Agent Sterling because he thought he was a robber. He profiled him because he thought he was a drug dealer he could rob. He saw a black man in a nice car and assumed it was his target, Rossi. He pulled him over to steal $50,000. "But he made a mistake," Kincaid said, turning to the jury. "He pulled over the FBI instead." Pandemonium broke out. The judge banged his gavel furiously. "Order! Order in this court!" Higgins wasn't looking at the jury anymore. He was looking at the table, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The narrative of the hero cop was incinerated in seconds. He wasn't a protector. He was a highwayman. The shark sat down slowly, closing his folder. He knew it was over. He whispered something to Higgins, likely telling him to prepare for prison. But the hard karma wasn't done yet. "We have one more witness, Your Honor," Kincaid said, twisting the knife. "A rebuttal witness to the defense's claim of Higgins' exemplary character." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. An older black woman walked in, using a cane. She walked with dignity, though her steps were slow. It was Mrs. Higgins, Derek Higgins' own mother. The courtroom gasped. Even Isaiah was surprised. He looked at Miller, who gave a small, grim nod. She took the stand, refusing to look at her son. "Mrs. Higgins?" Kincaid asked softly. "You approached the FBI voluntarily. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Why?" "Because," she looked at Derek, tears streaming down her face. "I raised him better. But I watched him change. I watched him bring home money he shouldn't have. TVs, jewelry. I asked him where it came from. He told me to shut up. Objection. Familial privilege. The shark tried, but it was weak. She is volunteering the information," the judge ruled. Overruled. "He called them thugs," Mrs. Higgins wept. "He said they didn't deserve what they had. He said he was just taxing them. But then I saw the video. I saw him put a gun to that man's head, that man who was just buying milk for his baby." She took a deep breath. "My father was a police officer. My grandfather was a police officer. They wore the badge with honor. My son, he disgraced them. He disgraced us all. I'm here because if I don't speak the truth, God will not forgive me." Higgins broke. He put his head in his hands and sobbed, loud, ugly, heaving sobs. It wasn't the tactical crying of the interrogation room. This was the sound of a man whose soul had just been laid bare by the one person who was supposed to love him unconditionally. Isaiah watched from the prosecution table. He didn't feel triumph. He felt a heavy, somber satisfaction. This was the twist. The blue wall hadn't destroyed Higgins. His own greed and his own mother's conscience had. The jury didn't even need to deliberate. But there was still the sentencing to come. And Isaiah had one final thing to say to Derek Higgins before he disappeared into the federal prison system forever. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. In a federal case involving civil rights violations and assault on a federal officer, that speed was a message in itself. When the foreman, a middle-aged mechanic with grease under his fingernails, stood up to read the verdict, Derek Higgins didn't even stand. He sat slumped in his chair, a broken man who had aged 20 years in 3 months. On the count of assault with a dangerous weapon on a federal officer, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of attempted extortion, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty rang out 7 times. Each one was a hammer blow to the life Derek Higgins had built on corruption and bullying. The blue wall had crumbled, the high-priced lawyer had failed, and the qualified immunity defense had been laughed out of the courtroom. Judge Harrison, who had been known for decades as a pro-police judge, looked down at Higgins over his spectacles. The revelation of the extortion scheme and the testimony of Higgins's own mother had clearly disgusted him. He wasn't looking at a police officer anymore. He was looking at a criminal who had stained the badge the judge respected. "Derek Higgins," Judge Harrison said, his voice gravelly and stern. "You have not only betrayed your oath, but you have also betrayed the trust of every citizen in this city. You used your authority as a weapon to terrorize and to steal. You saw a man you deemed lesser and decided you could destroy him. You were wrong." The judge paused, shuffling the papers on his bench. "The sentencing guidelines for these crimes are severe, but given the betrayal of public trust, I am applying the maximum enhancement. I sentence you to 25 years in a federal correctional institution, no possibility of parole." Higgins let out a strangled sob. 25 years. He would be an old man before he saw the sky without a fence again. "And," the judge continued, "I am recommending that you be placed in the general population at USP Lompoc." Higgins's head snapped up, terror flooding his eyes. "Your Honor! No, you can't. I was a cop. They'll kill me in Gen Pop. I need protective custody." "You were a cop," Judge Harrison corrected him coldly. "Now you are a convicted felon. And perhaps living among the people you tormented will teach you the empathy you so clearly lacked. Bailiffs, take him away." As the marshals hauled Higgins to his feet, Isaiah stood up. He walked to the wooden railing that separated the court from the gallery. He needed Higgins to look at him one last time. "Higgins!" Isaiah called out. Higgins stopped, panting, tears streaming down his face. He looked at the man he had tried to crush in the parking lot. Isaiah didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just leaned in close. "You remember when you told me I was a nobody?" Isaiah asked softly. "You remember saying you knew a smash and grab when you saw one?" Higgins nodded frantically, desperate for any mercy. "Well," Isaiah continued, his voice like granite, "you were right about one thing. I was working a case that night. But it wasn't the drug dealers. We were investigating a corruption ring within the precinct. We just didn't know who the ringleader was." Higgins's eyes went wide. "We had the bait car out there," Isaiah whispered. "We were fishing, and you bit the hook so hard you pulled the whole boat down. You didn't just ruin yourself, Derek. You gave us the evidence to indict your sergeant and 3 other officers this morning. You cleaned up the whole department." Higgins looked as if he had been punched in the gut. He hadn't just been unlucky. He had walked into a trap of his own making. He was the architect of his own destruction. "Enjoy Lompoc," Isaiah said, turning his back. "I hear the oat milk is terrible." The marshals dragged Higgins away, his wails echoing in the hallway until the heavy oak doors slammed shut. 6 months later. The rain had stopped in Seattle, replaced by the crisp golden light of early summer. Isaiah pulled his black Escalade into the driveway of his home. He wasn't wearing a hoodie today. He was wearing a crisp suit, his gold badge clipped to his belt. He stepped out of the car, grabbing a grocery bag from the passenger seat. He walked up the path, the smell of blooming jasmine filling the air. Sarah was on the porch, watching Maya draw with chalk on the driveway. The little girl looked up and squealed, "Daddy!" Isaiah dropped the bag and caught her as she ran into his arms, swinging her around. Her laughter was the best sound in the world. Better than a guilty verdict, better than a promotion. "Did you get it?" Sarah asked, smiling as she leaned against the doorframe. "Got it," Isaiah grinned, reaching into the bag. He pulled out a carton of premium oat milk. And I didn't even get arrested this time. Sarah laughed and kissed him. That's progress. They walked inside together, leaving the world outside. The nightmare in the parking lot was a scar now, not a wound. It had healed. But the city had changed. The story of the racist cop versus the FBI agent had become a legend in Seattle. The precinct had been overhauled. Body cams were now mandatory and strictly monitored. The blue wall was thinner, more transparent. And somewhere in a cell in California, Derek Higgins was sitting on a metal bunk, staring at a blank concrete wall. He had lost his freedom, his reputation, and his future. All because he judged a book by its cover and didn't realize that the man in the hoodie was the one holding the pen. Justice hadn't just been blind. It had been patient. And when it finally struck, it didn't miss. Isaiah poured a glass of milk for his daughter, watching the white liquid swirl in the cup. He took a sip of his coffee and looked out the window at his peaceful street. "Daddy, are you a superhero?" Maya asked, wiping a milk mustache from her lip. Isaiah smiled, looking at his badge on the counter. "No, baby," he said softly. "I'm just a guy who stood his ground, and sometimes that's enough." And that is the story of how one arrogant officer learned the hardest lesson of his life. Never judge a person by their appearance, because you never know who you're really dealing with. Officer Higgins thought he had the power, but he forgot that true power doesn't come from a badge or a gun. It comes from integrity. In the end, his own prejudice was the trap that cost him everything, proving that karma might be slow, but it always arrives with interest. What would you have done if you were in Agent Sterling's shoes? Would you have kept your cool, or would you have fought back right there in the parking lot? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.